Once again, this is your poster child for overactive brain disorder. I am Dominic, the kitchen table apologist, making bad videos about good topics. Today's good topic is a well-known proof of God's existence called the Ontological Argument and how it relates to my game director theory that I put up here earlier. So here's the basic overview of what I'm going to do with this video. First, I want to explain the ontological argument for God's existence, why it technically isn't a proof per se, and the limits of what we can show by it. Spoiler alert, it doesn't prove God's existence completely, but it does improve the probability so much that for many people it may as well be a proof. Second, I want to show how this argument changes the status of discussions about God's existence. Just because it isn't a proof doesn't mean it can't be useful in the discussion. Third, I want to explore how the game director theory that I proposed earlier can shed light on discussions of God's existence. Does it make God's existence more likely or less likely, and how? And finally, I want to explore what challenges posed to atheists by these considerations. Does it help or hurt their case, and how? With that, let's get to business and detail the ontological argument. It is presented as what is called a conditional argument, which means that it begins by assuming the truth of a proposition for the purpose of examining the consequences of its being true. The price of this assumption is that the conclusion isn't a clear-cut statement like, therefore God exists, but it ends up being a conditional or if-then statement like, if this is true, then this other thing is true. If done properly, it presents a valid argument whose truth depends entirely on the truth of the initial assumption, which can be debated independently. Now, the ontological argument begins by assuming that it is possible for something called a maximally great being to exist. Many people have no clue what a maximally great being is, so I'm going to define it here and explain how this helps us with our discussion of God's existence. Let's start with defining a maximally great value. We're talking about attributes of things, such as their size or height or power or some other measurable means of describing a thing. A maximally great value for an attribute, if it exists for that attribute, is that value which is the best possible one for the thing in question at all times in all places. An attribute does not necessarily have to have a maximally great value. Well, take bananas, for example. Is a ripe banana better or worse than an underripe banana, even if one is better than another in a given situation? Is it always better? Well, clearly, if I'm hungry and I want to eat the banana right now, I'd take the ripe one. But if I'm at the store buying bananas to use several days from now, I'd probably take the underripe one so that they don't spoil by the time I need them. Therefore, there's no value of banana ripeness that is maximally great, for there's always a situation where you need another ripeness that's better than the one that we have under consideration. Now, with this in mind, we can define a maximally great thing x. X is maximally great if and only if the following conditions are both true. First, there's at least one attribute of x's other than existence that can have a maximally great value. And second, the x in question has maximally great values for all attributes with a maximally great value, including the attribute of existence. So we can now specify what a maximally great being is. We can come up with maximally great values for some of the attributes of being, so the first part of the definition is satisfied. To demonstrate, let's list 4 attributes for which a maximally great value is obvious. Our first one is power. Beings have power with which they can affect the world around them. The maximally great value for power is called omnipotence, which means that the being has the power to do anything that is possible to do. Second one is knowledge. Beings can know things, which means that they have apprehended the truth or falsehood of certain propositions. The maximally great value for knowledge is called omniscience, meaning the being has all possible knowledge. The third one is presence. Beings can be present at a given time and location, which would enable them to participate in events there. The maximally great value of presence is omnipresence, meaning the being is present in all situations, in all places, and in all times, including the past and the future. And the last one we'll look at for now is benevolence. Humans are beings, and humans can show goodness from time to time. The maximally great value of benevolence is called omnibenevolence, meaning the being always does what is morally good. Now, given just these maximally great values, it is clear that there is only one being that could possibly fulfill this description, and that is God. We haven't yet asserted that God exists with this definition. All we are doing is acknowledging that if a maximally great being exists, that being would be God. Now, I realize some of you are thinking, well, why did you go from a maximally great being straight to God, who would more properly be called the maximally great being? Good question. So I'll take the time to show that there can't be more than one maximally great being. Alright, so let's assume that there are two or more maximally great beings. We can then choose two of these beings, call them M1 and M2. As I pointed out earlier, one of the attributes of beings that has a maximally great value is power, and the value of maximal power is omnipotence, or the ability to do any possible thing. So let's say we have M1 wanting to do something, but M2 doesn't want it done. Well, does this event happen? Well, if you say yes, well, sorry, you've just denied M2 maximal power, because M2 can't stop M1. So M2 is no longer maximally great. Well, if you answer no, well, you've just thrown M1 out of the running for maximal power, where he could be prevented from acting by M2. If the answer is it depends on other factors, sometimes M1 wins, sometimes M2 wins, neither one of them now has maximal power. So anytime you have two or more candidates for maximally great being, we can pair up two of them this way, apply our test here, and eliminate one or both of them consideration until we are down to either one maximally great being or none. Again, we haven't assumed that any such beings exist yet, so the 0 or 1 is as close as we can get at this point. Well, with all that background out of the way, we can now state the ontological argument. We are not going to assume that a maximally great being exists. We are only going to assume that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. Again, since we are starting with an assumption, the best we can conclude from this is an if-then statement. But as we can see, it will be enough to get us ridiculously close to saying that God exists. When we say that something possibly exists, it is logically the same as saying that there is a possible world for which that thing does exist. A possible world is a logically coherent set of circumstances upon which a world can be built. So if the thing possibly exists, that means there is a set of circumstances by which it actually would exist, and those circumstances describe the possible world. Now, by the definition of maximally great being, that being would have maximal values in all attributes for which a maximal value is defined, including existence. Now, in the case of existence, the maximally great value includes existing for all possible worlds. From this, we can conclude that if a maximally great being would exist for one possible world, it would exist for all possible worlds. Now, one possible world is the actual world. We know that the actual world is possible because it is here and we are living in it. So if a maximally great being exists for all possible worlds, it would exist for the world in which we live. Now, I would love to be able to go straight from here to, therefore, a maximally great being exists for the actual world, but I now have to pay the price of making an assumption at the beginning. So the best I can say at this point is, therefore, if it is possible for a maximally great being to exist, then that being does exist in the actual world. Again, not technically a proof of God's existence, but it's on the green with a tap and putt toward that goal. Yeah, but some of you are saying, wait, if this isn't a proof, what good is it? Why discuss something that only gets us close to God's existence, but doesn't quite get us all the way there? Well, even with this not quite making it all the way there, there are consequences to getting this close, and these are the consequences that I want to discuss next. The main consequence of the ontological argument is that the question of God's existence becomes biconditional. Let me explain that. For anything, if it actually exists, then obviously it is possible for that thing to exist. We use the axiom above, and it applies to anything you can think of. If it actually exists, then it is possible for the thing to exist. However, in the case of our maximally great being, i.e. God, the reverse is also true. If it is possible for the maximally great being to exist, then it actually does exist. This makes the statement of God's possible existence versus actual existence biconditional, meaning that it is possible for God to exist if and only if he actually does exist. Likewise, the only way for God to not exist is for his existence to be absolutely impossible. Now, because we are dealing with possible worlds here, it only makes sense for me to explain how my game director theory, which also deals in possible worlds, would mesh with this argument. If there is incompatibility, it suggests that one or the other needs to be adjusted to fit. As it turns out, there is great compatibility between these ideas. The possible worlds that we dealt with in the game director theory, namely those of authors, playwrights, role-playing game directors, and so on, have beings associated with them who mimic the maximally great values that we talked about when we started the ontological argument, when it comes to dealing with their own worlds. If we add in one more factor, we have even greater compatibility. That addition in the writing world is known as editing, and in role-playing world we call it retconning. Retcon is an abbreviation of retroactive continuity, and it's adjusting of events after they were played out in order to either correct a mistake or introduce an element that was meant to be played out but got missed, and so on. The final product is closer to the maximal greatness that we would expect. Again, we don't have an actual proof of God here, but we do have a couple of near misses on a proof. But these near misses put those who believe in God, and most specifically the Judeo-Christian idea of a God, and not just some random deity among any, in a much stronger position. It gives atheists a new challenge that makes their task of showing that there is no God harder. What do I mean? Let me go on. As I mentioned before, the ontological argument shows that if it is possible for a maximally great being to exist, then it actually does exist. And since the only candidate for maximally great being is God, if he is possible, then he is real. So our question is whether a maximally great being is even possible. Our intuition suggests that this is a possible thing, and it is reinforced by the considerations associated with the game director theory that I mentioned above. But the argument itself denies a common retort, namely the atheist saying, I believe such a being is possible, but I lack evidence for such a being, therefore I will not believe. The ontological argument tells us that if such a being is possible, that in and of itself is evidence of its existence. Thus the atheist has to show that a maximally great being is impossible. Improbable doesn't cut it because it's still a possibility. And when we add game director theory into the mix, we also have to explain why the suggestions of possibility that it offers are likewise misguided. Now, some people have tried to discredit the implications of the ontological argument by saying it can lead to weird conclusions. For example, what would happen if we replaced the word being in the ontological argument with pizza? Does this mean a maximally great pizza is possible? Now, we see no maximally great pizza. In fact, we think the idea of a maximally great pizza is absurd. So doesn't that offer a similar absurdity and evidence that the argument itself is absurd and should be discarded? Now remember that one of our criteria of a maximally great x is that x's must have at least one attribute with a maximal value other than that of existence. In the case of a pizza, what could that possibly be? The size of the pizza can't have a maximum value. Sometimes you want a 10-inch pizza. If you're sitting eating lunch by yourself, versus an 18-inch pizza that you're going to be sharing with a bunch of people. Are round pizzas better than square pizzas in all cases? Are square pizzas better than round pizzas in all cases? Maybe a rectangular pizza is better than all other pizzas. Actually, we don't really think so. It's not the case in all cases, so it's not a maximal value. Ingredients can't have a maximal value. You can't say 15 pepperonis on a pizza is the proper amount, the maximal amount, as opposed to 14 or 16 or whatever. Ingredients can't have a maximal value. Vegans don't want any pepperonis on their pizza. And some people don't want any vegetables. As there is no suitable attribute with a maximally great value, there is no maximally great pizza. For there to be a counterexample, we need to have something with a maximally great value other than existence that causes an absurdity when you assert that it exists in all possible worlds. So let's review. What does the ontological argument show? It shows that if God's existence is possible, then God actually exists. How does this change the discussion about God's existence? It may not prove that God exists, but it certainly does show that the only way God can't exist is if his existence is absolutely impossible. Now, how does the game director theory impact this discussion? It gives confirmation to our intuition that God's existence is possible. And lastly, what challenge does this pose to atheists? The examples from the game director theory make showing God's existence to be impossible, which is a necessary component to dismiss God due to the ontological argument, all that much harder to establish. Now, if you've made it here this far all the way through, thank you. Oh, look, there are links to subscribe and watch another video. You know you want to click on one of those. Go ahead. I won't tell anyone. I promise.